We are on page 27B. 27B. Good morning, everyone.
Right.
We learned yesterday about this machlokes, this argument between Rav and Shmuel regarding the reading of the Torah for the Ma'amodos. How was it done with regard to the fact that you normally need three psukim, three verses for everyone that's called up to the Torah, and some of the portions that we read for the Ma'amados don't have 9 verses, and the understanding, the general understanding was that you don't have 9 verses, you could read that day's Ma'amados, which means that day of creation, and you have the next day of creation as well that you're allowed to include as with it, with the reading, and altogether that should equal up to 9 verses. The problem is it doesn't. Like on the first day, we have 5 verses and 3 verses. It ends up being 8. So you have day one, you're already being somewhat lenient by allowing the second day of creation to be read on the first day. And even then, we're still stuck. So we have a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel how to go about it. And they basically come up with some type of solution. Either you repeat one of the verses, and this way, instead of having 8 verses, it turns out to be 9, or you split one of the verses in half, and instead of being 8 verses, now you've split one in half, one becomes 2. So you now have 9 verses, and basically each of the olim, each of the people who get aliyahs are able to recite 3 verses, and that should work. Now, we mentioned yesterday some interesting things about the fact that creation of the world, the Rashba, that things that happen on that day of creation has an impact. It has a certain powerful impact on for every week. Every single Sunday is some element of the creation of the world that took place on the first Sunday. It repeats itself, and we said the same thing with each day of the week. We brought some other sources to such a thing where you find that the Tanoim or the Amoraim, they were able to create certain things, and the reason they were able to create it was maybe specifically connected to the day that item was actually created by Hashem, and so on that day there's a greater potential to be able to do a similar thing and create it, because that's the day of creation of animals, or that's the day of creation of humans. And so we connected it to some other Gemaras as well, and so this is the discussion of our Gemara about the amount of verses. Now the problem, there are a few. The Gemara has a problem with these two opinions, and basically the Gemara wants to figure out, why doesn't Rav follow Shmuel's way of doing things, and why doesn't Shmuel follow Rav's way of doing things? And so the Gemara says that Rav holds you're not allowed to divide a pasuk if it's not divided. Any pasuk that's not divided, you can't go and divide it. And it makes it like that's like an established rule. That's a tradition. We don't divide anything that Moshe didn't divide. It's not divided that way in the Torah. You can't go and put a period in the middle of a verse and divide it in two and have two people and go up to the Torah and read each half. That's not appropriate.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes.
If there's an etnachta in the pasuk, isn't that the equivalent of a division?
So there is some. I did once see something about an esnachta, but I don't know. I mean, it's definitely not a safe pasuk, right? but there
No, but
might
it's
be
an end,
some heter. It's like
an end of a thought.
it's an end of a thought, maybe like a comma type of thing. So, I mean, our Gemara clearly says "lei paskinon" would be a safe pasuk, but I think there might be some source that if there's an asnachta, maybe some shita, there's some opinion that holds that maybe that's acceptable or something. I once heard something like that, that there was some heter of an asnachta. But the simple understanding of our Gemara is not that way. Is that um, let me tell you what they bring in the back over here. This is from Chofkas. He brings over here some Achreinim wrote right that if there's an asnachta or a zakif katan, zakif katan, what's a zakif katan? Okay, if katan, yeah, right, a zakif katan, yachal lahapsik. So that tune. Oh, let me just let some people in over here. So he says some Achreinim write that that's you're allowed to stop there because the taimim, the notes are a halacha l'meisha Sinai, and when there's an asnachta or a zakif katan, that's considered like a stop, and it's not a problem. Now, who says this? The Magen Gibayrim. Looks like we have some noise here. Mute everyone. Okay. So he brings from a sefer from Magen Gibayrim this idea. Okay. And he brings also that the Rav Pa'alim seems to accept this. And according to that, you can explain why we say in Kiddush Lavana, Tipol Aleim Imasav Fachad Bigdal Zeracha Yibn Kavin, which is only a half a pasuk. And because in the word Ka'avin, there's an Esnachta. And he says that's also how you say in Kiddush, Al Kain Berach Hashem Asiyam Shabbos Ve'ikadshe, which is also only a half a pasuk. And also the pasuk before that, Hashvi'i, there's an Esnachta, and Kriyash Mashalamita, say Kata Hashem Machsi Elyon Samta Ma'inecha. We just say half that, or it seems like there's a nusach of Kriyash Mashalamita that they only say half a pasuk. So he says, according to that, it's also understood. And he brings also Shilas Chuvas Torah Lishma. The source of this is a sefer brought in the Magen Gibayrim called Yachin Ubayaz, and that basically they want to say, so he says that you could rely on this only regarding an asnachta, which is like a safe pasuk. It's considered like Moshe stopped it, but he doesn't want to rely on it with regard to the zakif katan, which also is a zakif katan tune. It also sounds a little like it's stopping. Zakif katan. It sounds like that's the end of a thought. But in Shalos Chuvas Chasam Sefer, he asks on the words of the Yachin Ubayaz from our Gemara. Because according to this, why is Rav and Shmuel arguing that you can't stop? Or why is Rav arguing on Shmuel that you can't stop? Just there's an Esnachta. Stop by the Esnachta. Right? So our Gemara seems to prove that wrong, this idea. But there is such a thought. Again, it's this sefer, and it seems like he has maybe a few other opinions that seem to want to agree with it, but it doesn't seem to fit with our Gemara. Again, because our Gemara says that Rav argues on Shmuel. So and why does Rav argue on Shmuel? because of this reason, because Moshe didn't stop it and didn't divide this pasuk. And if this is correct, then then we should be allowed to do the Rosh Chodesh laning differently. We should just stop at the Asnachta. And seemingly, if maybe this is Shmuel's opinion, maybe that's what Shmuel holds. But if so, the halacha doesn't follow Shmuel, the halacha follows Rav. In other words, I like this idea. Sounds like a nice idea. Yeah, that's nachta should be considered like a safe pasuk. It sounds like a nice idea. I mean, it's not perfect because I don't see it as shaloi paske Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe didn't, any pasuk that Moshe didn't stop, and that the paske to me sounds like a final stop, not a esnachta, which is like the end of a thought. Sounds like a final stop. So I don't know. To me, I don't like the wording. But let's say that in logic, that maybe there is some, you could maybe say it. We see there are some poskim that seem to agree with it. It would seem to me like this is exactly what Shmuel maybe is saying, that you could stop in the middle, paisa. And if that's so, Shmuel, the halacha follows him in monetary laws, but doesn't follow him in halachic, in isurim, and regular laws that aren't monetary. So so that would be my question. Anyway, so he brings that there's some who want to say this, that the Yasnachta and Azakiv Katan is good enough. And then we saw that the Azakiv Katan, not everyone seems to agree with. Nishmas Adam writes, Davka b'derech kriyas ha-pasuk, in the way of reading the pasuk, you can't stop. But if it's done in a derech tefillah, then it's permissible. You're allowed to do it in a way of tefillah. So these are the different opinions about this whole discussion. Only if you're doing it as a chiyuv or drasha, you can't stop. But if you're only saying some words in more of a derech tzachos, like a joking manner, you're allowed. You know what I mean? Like you're just mentioning a verse, a line from a verse. That wouldn't be a problem. Then there's other heterim. If you only mechaven to read the pasuk, there's an isser. But if you're saying it as a proof to something, you're proving something from a pasuk, it's permissible. And some say the isser is only in a tzibur, is to do it in public. But if it's not in public, you're allowed to stop in the middle of the pasuk. So there are some heterim to stop in the middle of a pasuk. There are different opinions here that we just quoted about stopping in the middle of a pasuk. Basically, the commentaries are all struggling with this law that you're not allowed to stop in the middle of a pasuk, because much of our davening has examples and scenarios where we do this. Yahalalu Hashem Hashem Kiniskav Shemay Levado. Hoiday al Eretz v'Shamayim Vayorem currently Yamoy. These are half psukim. So the Chazan says Yahalalu, the congregation says Hoiday. These are half psukim. How do you do it? So there, what I mean? And then we have in the Haggadah numerous psukim that are half psukim, and we're not supposed to stop in the middle. We're supposed to finish off every pasuk. There's a big discussion on our Gemara from the commentaries. How does this fit with the practice that we're familiar with in numerous parts of our liturgy? Like it doesn't seem to fit.
Isn't there a difference between reading the Sefer Torah versus situations like as you're mentioning here in the Haggadah, or saying something within the davening?
So we did just see that there could be a difference in public. It could be a difference if it's a prayer, or you're studying Torah like a verse. Again, there's numerous heterim. There's numerous qualifications to that the different poskim authorities put on this law. So there is an opinion that says that you're you're not obligated to start every pasuk in the beginning of the pasuk, but you can't end a pasuk before its end. So that answers some of the scenarios that we have in our davening, that like Yahalalu Hashem Hashem Kiniskav Shemay Levadoi. The Chazan says that. The congregation says Hoydai Alerta Shemayim. We start in the middle of the pasuk, but we finish the pasuk. So as long as you finish the pasuk, it's not a problem maybe to start in the middle of the pasuk. The Chazan has a problem if he only says Yahalalu. He really is supposed to also say Hoydai al Eretz V'Shamayim in order to finish the pasuk, so that he says the whole pasuk and he doesn't stop it in the middle. So that's one of the Hatarim as well that I didn't quote for you before when I was reading that paragraph. But anyway, there are some Hatarim, but they ask on Shabbos Kiddush is an example of this, where we stop in the middle, where we or start in the middle, where we the Haggadah, the Yahalalu, so these are basically different issues that some say it doesn't apply to the Ksuvim. There is such an opinion that it only applies to Torah and Nevi'im and not to Ksuvim. Why that is, the commentaries struggle to know what the reason for the difference would be. But maybe in the Ksuvim you would be allowed to stop in the middle. It's only the Torah and Nevi'im. And so therefore that answers some questions about certain verses that are in the Ksuvim that we stop in the middle.
What about verses that have Hashem's name in it, as opposed to verses that don't?
No, that's not what we're dealing with. But there is a different issue when you bring that up about the Hashem's name. An issue could be that if you are saying a pasuk and you say Hashem instead of saying Hashem's name, that could be a problem, because now you're starting the pasuk and you're not finishing it properly, because you're changing Hashem's name for Hashem, right? So you've said the pasuk, but you didn't. You stopped it in the middle, so to speak, because you switched Hashem's name with an adjective for Hashem. You're saying Hashem, Kadosh Baruch Hu, So instead of saying a pronoun for Hashem, so instead of saying the pasuk properly and finishing it the way the pasuk ends, you now stopped in the middle. So that could be a problem. That's an issue when when you recite a whole pasuk. You should say Hashem's name if you're saying the whole pasuk without interruption. Now, if you're interrupting it, then that would be a reason why you wouldn't say Hashem's name. But then you have to figure out: are you allowed to? What category does that fall under? There definitely are some. There definitely are a lot of qualifications to this, and they do bring down a number of different opinions about when would it be permissible. So we've seen a few. If it's in the context of praises and prayer, it's not a problem. If ksuvim, and then I told you about the ending the verse in a place that's not meant to end it, but the starting, you could start in the middle of a pasuk, and so these are some of the explanations of how why we do things the way how it's permissible for what we do. And again, we have that esnachta opinion that if you stop at the end of the thought in the pasuk, that could be a heter. There is some source for it, even though it doesn't seem to fit with our Gemara. The other leniency is if it's in public. If it's not in public, and only in public, it could be a problem. Or if you're only bringing the pasuk as a you're showing something from a pasuk, but you're not planning on learning that pasuk or reciting the, you're just bringing a little source from some part of that verse. So it's not like you're trying to say the verse.
The
or you have
reason
an
why,
obligation
Rabbi,
to say that. Yeah.
the reason why I brought the Etnachta is because there's an opinion that says, for example, if there are five psukim in a paragraph, and there are two people that's supposed to read it, there is one opinion that says that you split one of the psukim, but they don't say where.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm suggesting the
Maybe
Etnachta
that's
as a
what it means, right?
possibility.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that's what I was mentioning, that maybe that's the opinion of Shmuel. In other words, that could be that's what Shmuel is saying. That asnachta works, and Rav is seemingly arguing on it. That's how you could you could understand that. In other words, the way that the Paiskim are bringing this opinion, they're trying to say that that's the halacha, which sounds like even Rav would agree with that. But if you want to fit it into our Gemara, yeah, that would seemingly be the opinion of Shmuel, and Rav would be arguing on that and says, no, we can't rely on a snachta zakif katan. You have to, it has to be the end of a pasuk. So maybe Rav doesn't go over that. He says if it's not the end of a pasuk, it's not acceptable. And Shmuel also doesn't like it. He says, b'diavad, if you have no choice, that's where that you could do, and maybe it's specifically in an asnachta. That would be seemingly a good insight, and maybe that's the story of this Rav Chanina Hagadol that gave a heter to stop for the children in order to teach them that maybe he gave him the heter to stop at the asnachta and the zakef katan. I would think that would probably be where he's stopping, because it needs to be the end of the thought. So maybe that was his heter. Maybe that's because Shmuel holds that way. Maybe there's like a heter, to rely on him in case of a great necessity, and maybe that's the case. Anyway, but our Gemara doesn't clarify Shmuel's opinion. So this is a nice thought, and yes, Ezra, very it sounds like a correct thought. The other thing that is a big question on our Gemara is we have this whole problem. We don't have enough psukim. So what do? Either divide it. So we're reading the first day of creation, and we're reading the second day of creation, and we still don't have enough psukim. We don't have enough verses. So what are we going to do? We're going to figure out some dre. We're gonna figure out some heter. But let me ask you a question. Why can't we just do day 3? We have day 1 and day 2 that don't have enough psukim. So add on day 3. Let the first guy get the aliyah for day 1. The second guy can do the day 2 of creation, and the third guy we'll let him do day 3. What's wrong with that? Seemingly, day 1 is the ideal, because it's Sunday today. We have to read day 1. Okay, you don't have enough psukim. I don't know what to say, but you're allowing day 2. So if you're allowing day 2, allow day 3 also. So one of the commentaries says something interesting. He says, almost all the days of the week, maybe all the days, we have problems with not enough verses. So every day we're adding on from the next day. It's not exactly connected. The day 1 is really day 1 and not day 2. But because we have absolutely no choice, every day we add on from the next day. Fine. We add on from day 2 to day 1. Day 2 adds from day 3, and so on. We add on from the next day. Only specific days have a problem that it's still not enough. Like day 1. Day 1 is only 8 verses even with day 2. So in that scenario, what do you want to do? Do day 3 also? then guess what's going to happen? You're going to cause jealousy amongst the days of creation. All the other days are going to be jealous. We only get to be recited on our day and the day before. And the third day, day 3, gets to be recited also on 2 days before us. In other words, day 3 is Tuesday. Tuesday is being recited on Sunday, on Monday, and on Tuesday. All the other days of the week are going to be jealous of Tuesday. You're going to create jealousy in Maisa Bereshis, in the creation of the world. And what that means is that when we read these psukim, the actual entities of creation are getting their sustenance, so to speak. They're getting their energy. We're reading, the Ma'amades are reading the days of creation. They are enjoying, when we read the days of, the Ma'amades are reading the days of creation, they're giving enjoyment to the days of to the physical days of the week. And if you do more, if you read an extra paragraph on one of the days, the other days of creation are going to be jealous. So we don't want to create jealousy in Maisa Bereshis, the creations of the world. That's one opinion. The other opinion is that each day needs another day. There's no way out. But a third day, there is a way out. You could do Rav and Shmuel's option. So that's another way of answering this question. Rav and Shmuel do have an option, do have a way of adding one verse. But the reading itself is impossible without adding another day. You need to add another day. So we do day 1 and day 2, or day 2 and day 3, day 3 and day 4. Each day is, we add on, but to add on an additional day, that we're not going to do, because we have Rav's or Shmuel's option. Of course, it's not ideal, but it's the only way to go about it. Okay, so that's basically the Gemara that we learned yesterday, and we've added like the Heterim to do some of the leniencies and qualifications of when you can divide up a pasuk. There's another question they ask from Bikurim, the verses that you read when you bring the first fruits into the Beis Hamikdash and give it to the Kohen. So there is such a question over there as well, that the verse seems to end in the middle. How do you do that? And there seems to be a heter, because that is the paragraph that Hashem wants us to say, even though it stops in the middle of a verse. In other words, it's like the pasuk is telling you, say these words, So even though it's the middle of a pasuk, but that's like the prayer that we're supposed to say for the Bikurim. So it ends in the middle of a pasuk. It ends in the middle of a pasuk. We're saying it because that's what we're told to say as part of our prayer, as part of our recital. Okay, so back to the Gemara. Let's see where we're up to over here. We're on page 27b.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Where is it brought? Which Gemara is it brought? The first mentioning of the trup.
The mentioning of the trup, I believe, Megillah, it talks about it there.
I guess I'm asking, like, how's it brought down? Like, which rabbis were the originators of that they said that this is the tradition that was given to them, that they heard from their teachers about which trup goes where?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess we could maybe look it up, but I mean, we know it's all oral. There's an oral tradition of all the trup and all the notes. In other words, Seif Pasuk is part of the trup, and it's part of the like the end of the pasuk. That's part of the trup. If you learn the trup, Pashta Munach Zarko Nach Sagoil, and it ends with Seif Pasuk. So so those are all part of and those are all oral. It's really orally taught. It's not, it's not written in the Torah. It's not part of the Chumash. It's orally taught. But where does it talk about it? I believe it's in the Gemara Megillah. Where it brings this Gemara there as well about Doileg and Pesach, and
maybe I'll look it up on
we'll
Wikipedia.
Try to, we'll have to look it up, but I think that's where you'll find it. Okay, so the Gemara that we're up to. Oh, so then the story. I'm sorry, I didn't review that whole story. So Reb Chanina Kara. So Reb Chanina would teach. Chanina was a like a reading expert, or so he would teach the kids how to read. So he said, Tsar Gadol, I had took a lot of pain when I was by Rabbi Chanina HaGadol to get a leniency. But he only gave me a leniency to teach the children, for the children. Because when I teach adults, I don't have this leniency. But teach children, Tinoy Gishel Beis Rabba, and I have a leniency. I'm allowed to stop in the middle of the verse. I can divide a verse. So, and the reason is because it's for teaching purposes and make it easier to teach or whatever it is. So therefore, it's permitted. So the Gemara asked that on Shmuel, why do you allow the dividing a verse in the shul? I have a heter which was not easy to get. I got this permit, and it wasn't easy. It's an interesting term he used. I had to beg him for a leniency. You wouldn't expect that from in the Gemara, that he says Tsar Gadol. I took great pain by Rav Chanina HaGadol to get this, and he only gave me a leniency for this. For the teaching children. Anyway, but it says, so how does Shmuel allow such a thing for not for children? Because Shmuel holds that you divide this portion in one of the psukim, you divide in two. And so the Gemara answers, there's no other way out. And just like with children, there's no other way out. Here also, there's no other way out. It's lo yefsher. And then the Gemara says, why doesn't Shmuel hold like Rav? And the answer was because Rav's way seems a lot more halachic. In other words, it fits Jewish law better. Rab's way is, okay, so repeat one of the psukim. Let one guy read the pasuk, and then the next guy can also review that pasuk and go continue. What's wrong with that? But the Gemara then says, no, we have a big problem. There's always people coming in late and leaving early. And so it's not a new thing, even though, now we live busier, we have busier schedules. There was always this problem. There's always people coming late and leaving early, even time of the Gemara. And they made a gzeira, the rabbis made a decree about it, that we have to be careful. People might make a mistake and not be and assume things that are not correct. And I think that's the reason why we all say the bracha on Berachas HaTorah initially, when they would call up 7 or 8 people for the Shabbos laning. Used to only be the first bracha was said by the kohen aliyah, and the final bracha about Asher Nasalanu, that final bracha was only recited by the final person who was called up to the Torah, and he didn't say the Baruch Hu Hashem HaMavarach and Baruch and Asher Baruch Arbanu. He didn't say that. So he would only say the final bracha. So in other words, and all the middle people who got called up, they would just get called up and read. They wouldn't say the brachas. But we were afraid. What about the people who came late? They don't know that there's a bracha before the Torah. And what about the people who leave early? They don't know that there's a bracha at the end of the Torah reading. So therefore, the rabbis established, if I'm not mistaken, that's the reason that every person gets called up to the Torah, and I think that's in Gemara Megillah, that every person gets called up to the Torah has to say the brachas before and after, because of the people who come late and people who leave early. So the same thing here. Shmuel says, you want to repeat a pasuk? What's going to happen? The problem is, what are people going to think? The guy who comes late, what's he going to think? He's going to say, you can say 2 verses, because if this guy started at verse number 3, the previous guy must have read verse 1 and 2. So you're allowed to do just 2 verses when you read the Torah. So he's going to come out with the wrong assumption. And then what about the guy who comes late? who, I'm sorry, what about the guy who leaves early? So he's going to hear the first guy read verse 1, 2, and 3. And he's going to say, okay, I got to leave now. But interesting, this guy did 1, 2, and 3. That means the next guy is going to do 4 and 5, and that's the end of the paragraph. So I see, okay. Oh, interesting. So I guess you're allowed to do 2 verses, 4 and 5. That's okay. That's kosher. So it's a gezerah mishum hayotzin, mishum anachnosin, and gezerah mishum hayotzin. It's a gezerah because the people who enter late and they enter in the middle of the reading, and gezerah mishum hayotzin. It's a decree for those that leave in the middle of the reading. Yes, Jeffrey.
I'm very interested in all of these changes also. But I think there was another important development. And that was that the people who were called up could no longer read the psukim themselves. They had to appoint somebody to be the reader. So originally, when the people who came up read...
Yeah, we mentioned that yesterday. We spoke about it. Yeah, you weren't here. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry. So that's why we say both brachas.
Right. I'm not sure if that's the reason we say both brachas, because you have a balkaire. I don't know if that's correct, because in some shuls they do have people getting their own. I don't think that's the reason. I have to look it up, but I don't believe so. I believe the reason for both brachas is the nechnasin and the yotzin, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay.
Well, I'm sure it depended on the conditions of the period. But once people couldn't read Hebrew, because they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. And this is a time of Ezra also, because he was more educated. He had this tradition, but other people would speak Aramaic. So he made the takana that they should tell the meaning of each verse. So they also decided that you can't only tell the meaning of just 2 verses. You have to tell the meaning of 3 verses, I believe.
Okay, anyway, we'll have to look it up. Very good, very good. Thank you, Jeffrey. So the Gemara continues over here and says Mesve. We have a contradiction, Mesve. So we are on page 27, Chav Zayin, Amud Beis, B, 27b. And in the Gemara itself, Mesve, 4 lines up from the bottom of the page. And if you're in the art school, it's 27b3. The Gemara says, Mesve, they asked a contradiction to Rav and Shmuel. What's the contradiction? A portion of 6 verses, you can read it by 2 people. Vishal Chamisha, but if there's a portion that only has 5 verses, and remember, every person who gets an aliyah gets called up to the Torah, he needs to have 3 verses. So if the paragraph only has 5 verses, so only 1 person can read that paragraph. B'yachid, that's read by 1 person. And this is the contradiction to Rav and Shmuel. Because according to Rav and Shmuel, it's not true. Even if you have a paragraph of 5 verses, you could divide one of the verses in 2, or have someone repeat one of the verses, and you basically can have 2 people read a paragraph that only has 5 verses, either Rav's way or Shmuel's way. Either you repeat one of the verses, in other words, each person says verse 3, and then you have 3 verses for each, or you divide verse 3 in half, and then you have verse 1, 2, and 3, and you have verse 4, 5, and 6. You've just added a verse, so to speak, because you divided 1 in half. So either way, you have Rav's way or Shmuel's way. You have a way of having a 5-verse paragraph read by 2 people who are getting an aliyah. So that seems to be a contradiction. Now, the Brisa continues with it continues that what happens if a person read 3. The im harishain kaira gimel, if the first person read 3, the first reader, so what do the other people do? What does the next guy who gets called up do? And this is not at least the way we're translating the Gemara now, this is not really connected to being the contradiction to Rav and Shmuel. The contradiction was already stated, but the Brisa continues and just mentions that if the first person read 3, then what does the second guy who gets called up to the Torah do? Second one will be called up to read, and he'll read 2 from this portion and 1 from the next portion. And basically, according to this opinion, we're not worried about people coming late, because if a guy reads one verse from the next portion, the guy who comes late is going to say, "Oh, I guess you can just read 1 verse and fulfill your obligation," because we're starting the new reading at verse 2. Sounds like the previous guy just read 1 verse. So this opinion probably holds. I know this Brisa understands a little differently than we've understood until now, and is not nervous of the gezerah, the decree about people who come late. And anyway, then the Brisa says, but some say that Gimel would have to read 3 from the next verse. In this way, you would cover the issue of gezerah, the decree of people who come late, because then they'll see that the second person who gets called up, I should say the third person who gets called up, will be reading from verse 4 and onward, which means that verse 1, 2, and 3 were read by the previous guy, and that will be understandable that you need 3 verses in order to be called up to the Torah. So, we don't begin a paragraph and read less than 3 psukim. In other words, you shouldn't stop less than 3 psukim into a paragraph, because a person's going to come late and assume that the previous guy read only 2 psukim. So the Gemara says, "Laman da amar doileg lidleg." According to the opinion that says doileg, which is rav, that you can leap backwards and repeat a verse. So why does our Brisa say that you need a paragraph of 6 verses in order to have 2 people read it? Let them do even a 5-verse paragraph. Let one let the second person who gets the aliyah reread verse 3. Let him jump back a verse, and he could reread verse 3, and you could have a 5-verse paragraph read by 2 people who get aliyahs. And according to the opinion that says you can divide a verse in half, let him split the verse number 3 in 2, and then you could have a 5-verse paragraph read by 2 people who get aliyahs. My answer is Shani Hasam there is different. The Islay Revacha, that there is room. In other words, there's no need to use one of these leniencies of dividing. By our scenario, where we're talking about the Ma'amados, we're talking about the Israelites who are reading the Torah in their communities. They're gathering together and reading the Torah portion of the creation of the world, and they specifically want to read the day's portion that's connected to that day, meaning the day of the week. It's connected to the day of the creation of that day of creation. And so that's where we have a problem, and we need to try to push in as many aliyahs as we can to fit in that day. And we don't want to read another, we don't want to read another day of creation, as I explained. We're limited to reading that day of creation, and because we have no choice, we'll read one more day. So Sunday reads Sunday and Monday, but we're not going to go further than that. And we need to divide up one of the verses, or we need to leap back and reread one of the verses. That will do. But in a normal scenario where you're not so limited, there you don't have to do the deal. Read one person can read five verses, a 5-verse paragraph. Call one person up to read it, because we don't have any limitation on a regular like Shabbos or something. Read it, no problem. Here we're limited with what we're reading because we want to read specifically in Yana D'Yoima, something connected to that day of creation. The Mondays are specifically recreating the creation. So they specifically need to read the right portion. There will rely on these leniencies of how to fit into a 5-verse paragraph, 6 verses. And that's basically this Gemara. Okay, now we're up to the 2 dots on page 28A, the top of the page. Parsha Gedola Koirin Oisa V'Shnayim. The big Parsha, the Mishnah said that you have 2 people read it. B'Shachris uva Musaf, Shachris and in Musaf. Uva Mincha Koirin al PM. On Mincha, they read it by heart. And the Mishnah said, similar to how you read the Shema, full, etc. Iboilahu, the Bnei Yeshiva, the Yeshiva had a question of how to read this Mishnah. Because when it says Musaf, it's a little unclear. Does Musaf go with the first half of the sentence, or does Musaf go with the second half of the sentence? It would have been nice if Hebrew would have commas, or the Gemara and the Mishnah has commas, but it doesn't. And so we are stuck using our heads and trying to figure it out through logic or through other sources, and figuring out which where to put the comma when we read it. So it says the big portion, you read, 2 people read it. And
question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
If Musaf went with Mincha, then you wouldn't need that Vav before Ube Musaf. I think the Vav that's there connects it to B'Shachrit.
Yeah. Sounds like a good diuk. Again, I'm not such a good medaic, I'm not so good at grammar, but I guess you have a good point. Let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Gemara says they asked, it was a question to them. They had this question, what is, how is it said? The Shachris of a Musaf, do you read it Shachris and in Musaf Karin Isai, they read it the Sefer from the scroll? Or Uva Mincha and Uva Mincha Karin Isai, and on Mincha they read it by heart, Karin Shema, like you say Shema. Or maybe Hachi Katani, this is what it means. Shachris Karin Isai Sefer. They read it in the scroll. Musaf, Mincha, Karin Isa, Alpek, Karin Eshma could be read. It's read at Mincha. They read it at Musaf and in Mincha by heart, like they read the Shema. The Gemara says, brings a proof from a Brisa. Tashema coming here. The Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, B'Shachris uva Musaf, Echnasan leVeis HaKnesset, and Shachris and then Musaf, they enter the shul, meaning the Ma'amades, the Israelites, or according to one opinion, the Israelites, the Levites, and the Kohanim, representing the community, they enter the shul, and in each city, in each of the Kohen Kederach Kohen Kol Hashana, and they read the same way they read all year round, meaning from a Torah scroll. Over Mincha, excuse me. Over Mincha, Yachted Kairi Yosel. And at Mincha, an individual would read it by heart. Now here, um, the brisa spells it out a little more clear, because what it does here is it doesn't push together Shachris, Musaf, Mincha all in one jumble. It divides it up and says Shachris and Musaf, you enter the shul. You read like you read all year round. And Mincha separately, it mentions at the another clause of this, even though there's no comma, but you see clearly it's a different clause. And it says Mincha Yachid Kaireis Alba, an individual reads it by heart. So that seems to spell it out pretty clearly. And then Amar Rabbi Yosi says, can an individual read it by heart in a community? Ella rather, Hula Nichnasin. They all enter the shul. The Kairanaisa al peh, and they read by heart, each of them, like they read the Shema. So in other words, Rabbi Yosi understood the first opinion, that one individual reads it, says it by heart, and the congregation fulfills their obligation from listening to that person read it by heart. Rabbi Yosi argues on that. He doesn't argue about mincha or musaf. He only argues that how is it done? That's not appropriate to have someone in public read the Torah and say the Torah by heart. It should be read from, if you're doing it in public, you have to read it from a scroll. But individually, you would be, Rabbi Yosi says they could read it, they are, and they're supposed to read it to themselves individually. That's not a problem. This seems to be maybe a source that if you're not reading to be moitzi, to fulfill the obligation of other people, but you're rather just reading for yourself, saying Torah for yourself, you would be allowed to say things by heart. Maybe this could be a little source, because there's a famous rule that Devarim Shebechsav, you're not allowed to say things that are the written Torah. We're not supposed to recite by heart. So how do we, people say Ashrei, they say things, people are, where it's very hard to always have a siddur in front of you. So there seems to be different qualifications to this rule as well. Like, when does it apply? As you're going on the street, you need to say Tillim. You didn't finish your Tehillim, your daily Tillim, and you normally say this chapter and that chapter. You know it by heart, so you're allowed to say it or not. It's Dvarim Shebechsav. The Tehillim is the written Torah. Would you be allowed to recite it by heart without looking inside? Or you don't have your siddur, and or you're walking around the shul for whatever reason, need to get a tissue. Can you continue reciting Ashrei, or can you continue reciting a paragraph that while you're finding the box of Kleenex in the shul? Can you continue reciting some of the davening? So there's a rule that normally you're not supposed to say things by heart. But there is one of the qualifications is if you're not being moitzi other people, you're not causing others to fulfill their obligation. You're rather just reciting for yourself. So that would be seemingly permissible. And our Gemara, our Brisa here seems to say that, at least Rabbi Yosi says you can't have one person fulfill everyone's obligation, but the first opinion seemed to say you could, but the Rabbi Yosi says no, you can't do that. But what you can do is that you could read it individually. So it sounds that that they could read it individually by heart to themselves. All right, now the next Gemara. Kol yom sheyesh b'chalo. every day that has Hallel in by Maimed. There's no Ma'amadis. Because they're saying Hallel, it's taking up time from the extra prayers of the Ma'amadis, so they don't do the Ma'amadis. Now, the Mishnah had a whole discussion of which Ma'amadis does Musaf cancel, does the day that has Ne'ilah, what gets canceled, which prayer is canceled. So we had a machlokes in the Mishnah. Actually, let's pull up the Mishnah. Maybe that's a better way to do this. So the Mishnah was on page 26. And this was, of course, a little confusing in the Mishnah because we had Rabbi Yoshua, we had Rabbi Akiva. But basically, any day that had Hallel, so Rabbi Akiva said initially that you don't do Ma'amadis at Shachris. It means the people who were part of the Maimed, they didn't have time to recite these extra prayers because they're busy saying Hallel. It could be that there are different opinions in the commentaries if this also applies to the Ma'amadis of in the shuls. It seems to be a machlokes of the commentaries about that. But basically, there's no ma'amadis at shachris. Then there's what happens in a day that there's musaf, and that would be like a Rosh Chodesh. So you don't do ma'amadis in the Ne'ilah prayer. And basically, the people from the Ma'amadis were busy bringing this extra musaf sacrifices, and they didn't have time to do the Ma'amadis. So here it says at Ne'ilah, but seemingly the meaning is even at Ne'ilah, meaning they didn't do it musaf, they didn't do it mincha, and they didn't do at Ne'ilah. Then it says Karban Eitzim, the day that they would bring that wood offering ceremony, which was a special holiday. So they don't do the Ma'amadis at Mincha. This was a special holiday, and they were busy celebrating. So they would skip the Mincha Ma'amadis, but they would do it. They would do the Ma'amadis at Ne'ilah. They just skipped at Mincha. Now, this is Rabbi Akiva's initial statement, and then the Gemara switches things and says that if there's Musaf, then you don't do it. You don't do Ma'amadis at Mincha, and if there's a Karban Eitzim, you don't do it at Ne'ilah. And then Rabbi Akiva seemed to switch his view and wanted to follow the way Rabbi Yeshua said, and which is quoted by Ben Azai. Okay, so our Gemara tells us that Ma Hefresh Bein Zeh L'Zeh. Why does the Karban Eitzim, when they brought the wood offering, why would it exempt the Ne'ilah, but it wouldn't exempt the Mincha service, right? It exempts the Ne'ilah, but according to Karban Eitzim Ein Ben Ne'ilah, according to the final view in the Mishnah. So the Gemara answers that halalu divrei Torah v'halalu divrei Sefer. That Mincha and Ne'ilah are very different. Mincha seems to have biblical source. So this is biblical, and Ne'ilah is only rabbinic. And this is an interesting discussion. Is the davening of Mincha really biblical? And as we rely on sort of based on Yitzchok, who davened Mincha by Yetze Yitzchok Lasuach Basada, but it's not so clear that we're obligated. In other words, did he make it an obligation on everyone? Before Matan Torah. So is it really biblical, a biblical obligation to daven Mincha? Is there, is it seemingly Mincha is a rabbinic obligation? Or anyway, there's a big machlokes, the Rambam and the Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides about davening about davening in general. Is davening biblical or rabbinic? And generally, each of the prayers, at least, are understood to be rabbinic. Anyway, but the Gemara here says that mincha is considered divrei Torah, and Rashi brings Yitzchok was masakin it, and Ne'ilah is rabbinic, and it needs to be strengthened, and will I'm sorry, not that it needs to be strengthened. Rashi says don't be girders; it needs to be strengthened. Ne'ilah is rabbinic, and therefore it could be pushed off, and mincha is not pushed off. Okay, we're gonna stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful
Thank you, Rabbi.
day. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.